Hey, what's going on everyone? Welcome to today's video. So today we have a little unboxing and install for you. Also a little review of the product that we go ahead and unbox and install. And this one is one that most, if not all of us who deal with the Beat 5 platform will have to encounter or deal with at some point. And that is the DriveShaft carrier or the DriveShaft carrier bearing. So on our cars, the drive shaft is split in two. We have that U-joint in the middle, as you all have probably seen it if you work on your cars. And holding up that flex is a carrier which has a bearing so that the drive shaft can spin freely while the carrier holds it. That carrier is molded on to that bearing with rubber. And after a while, that rubber tends to crack, it just corrodes and goes bad with so many years of use. So these cars are 20 years old now. All, if not most, of these are probably bad and cracking and have gaps, which leads to clunking and lash on our drivetrain. And we had the good folks over at JXB Performance send us this over. So this is their solution to the drive shaft carrier bearing issue. And I think it's actually the most solid solution out there. So let's take a look at the box, see what they sent us, look at install, and then give you guys a quick review of what this does for us. Okay, so we're gonna take a quick look inside our box. So once you open it up, we're greeted with the product here, wrapped in bubble wrap. So we'll look at what's in this top package here. So once we open that up, you see that we have here some rubber bushings. And then we have two other packs here. These are also rubber bushings, a little smaller, and we'll explain how those work out right now and how those fit into the entire assembly. Next up in the box, we have the carrier. That was probably loud. Anyway, this is the carrier here, which is the star of the show. So you see here has the JBX logo. Really nice piece. It's black anodized aluminum, lightweight, high quality, and I wish this would show, It's I'm about to put a mirror under my car so that people can see the drive shaft bearing when I park. Okay, so to explain to you how this works, the bearing is a two-piece. So you see here we have the two halves separated. They're held on by these 6mm Allen head bolts. Now, inside of the bearing is where we put the main bushing. So the main bushing you see here, we have two sets of identical parts. The only difference is the density of the rubber that they are made out of. So this is the street. You can see this is much flimsier. And then we have the track, which is a lot tougher, higher durometer. Like most other mounts, the softer it is, the less vibration it transfers into the cabin, less NVH, and more comfort. The stiffer mount allows for more vibration into the cabin. That's what you sacrifice, but you also gain a stiffer drivetrain, so you get better response, better shifter feel, and so on and so forth, similar to most other mounts. On the sides of either one of those, we have the corresponding bushings. So the bushings as well are in street and in track densities, very similar to the main bushings. And these bushings are there to separate the mount piece, which is this here, from the body and from the hardware that's holding it in place. So this design here is there so that it reduces the amount of vibrations that go into the cabin. So that way, again, we reach a higher comfort level and a lower noise level within the cabin, depending on which bushing you select. Again, the track bushings will be a little noisier and transfer a little more NVH. Now, this piece also comes with new hardware. So these are the new bolts that we'll be using to install the carrier onto the body of the car. So it's great that they include new hardware. It's really high quality hardware. You also get two sets of washers for the installation onto the body. So just to give you guys a quick understanding of how this works, let's say we are going to use the street bushings. So the way you set them up is there's a label right at the top. So it says front street. So you see street front there. So this would be facing the front, which on the carrier you see here says front. So that's how we'd install that, front to front. And the same thing for the bottom side of the carrier. So this would be street front So we would install this towards the front, this being the front of the carrier. So you see the arrows there. So this would fit like this. Now, when you have these installed, this would go around the drive shaft, and we'll explain that to you in a bit once we get under the car and get everything set up. And you would use this hardware to go ahead and hold this together around the drive shaft. So this would be squeezing the drive shaft in between the two halves of the carrier. Now, once we get these tightened, we'll just loosely tighten these so that way it all holds together. Now that these are all together, the drive shaft would be squeezed in here. So this would be holding the drive shaft in place now. So any forward and backward movement that you would have, or any lash from the drive shaft, would be held by this bushing here. So as the drive shaft tries to move, the bushing would hold it in place. Now here we have the two holes where the carrier would be held onto the car by this hardware. So what we need to do is install two of these bushings, again depending on whether you want the street or track density. Now there's a little bit of a recess in here, and in that recess is where you would put this protruding part of that bushing. And now that that's on, the rest of it would be with the washers. So you would slide one of the larger washers onto the bolt like so. That would then go from under, through the two bushings, and through the carrier. And then we put one of the smaller washers on top there. So that's how it would be installed onto the car. Now these bushings are here to control the NVH for this entire setup. So the softer bushings would transfer less onto the car, and the harder would transfer more, of course. And the way they do that is by separating the entire assembly from the car, and from the hardware. So you would have a slight bit of movement depending on which of the densities you went with, leading to more comfort. Now that you have an idea of how this all works, we'll head under the car and I'll show you how to install this. First step would be removing our exhaust, so let's get started there. All right, so this is future me. I just came back from a drive and this felt, well, I'll tell you in a bit. So you gotta wait till the end of the video for that. But I just want to remind you that JXB not only makes these for the B5 platform, so it fits A4, S4, and RS4, but they also make these for the B8, B7, B6 platforms, as well as the D4, D5, and C6 and C5 platforms. So they cover almost every Audi out there, because almost every Audi out there has this issue. So as the platform ages, this becomes a must-do mod and upgrade, because the OEM carrier just really goes to crap. So it's nice to have somebody out here doing the research and finding a solution for a problem that we all have and making it an easy install. So this install is super simple. I just went through it, so I could say that. But just make sure to check them out. I'm gonna put the link in the description below to this exact part, as well as their website, so you can check out the rest of their products for the B8, B7, B6, C4, C5, C6, and all the other cars that they do support, as well as some NQB stuff as well. Okay, so in a few steps, we're actually gonna need a couple of these tools. So you're gonna need either a grinder with a cutoff wheel, or a Sawzall, or you could actually use a Dremel with a cutoff wheel as well. And you'll also need a sharp blade. So we're gonna use two of these tools to get the old carrier off. Let's take a look at that. All right, so our first step here would be to get our exhaust removed, because our exhaust runs right under where our drive shaft is. So this step is a little different for everyone. I'm single turbo, so you see here I only have one pipe coming all the way back, starting right around here and going straight back. So in this case, I'm gonna go ahead and remove my exhaust. For those of you who have different exhaust setups, you just have to drop the exhaust down a bit. You don't have to remove it completely. So what you can do is just loosen it where the down pipes are, and then drop the rest of the exhaust. That should give you enough clearance to get what we need to do done. All right, so before we get started on the install here, I wanted to show you guys a little something. So on the left side, we're looking at a stock drive shaft carrier in very good condition. So this one's practically new. And on the right side, we're looking at a JXB performance carrier. So you can see how different these two perform in the various conditions here. So we're looking at launches as well as just easing onto throttle. And the movement between the two is night and day. And this is comparing movement to a carrier that's in good condition. Now you can imagine how big of a difference you'll feel going from an old, 15 to 20-year-old carrier and comparing it to a new JXB carrier. So it's going to be a night and day difference during shifting, easing onto throttle, and letting off of throttle. Now again, we run into one of those circumstances where my setup is a little different than yours. So in this case, my car does not have the shield that goes over the drive shaft because of space constraints. So in this case for you, you would have an aluminum shield that goes directly over this area here, and you'd have to remove that. That's held on by 10mm nuts, which go into these studs here. So you'll see them all around. Remove those 10mm nuts, and then that shield would just drop off and you'll have access to your drive shaft carrier. And as you can see, that is in pretty rough condition, and we can only imagine how bad the rubber is under it. You can actually see it's cracking and pretty bad under there. And you can observe how much movement the drive shaft has in there. So all that is causing lash and movement and can actually ruin your rear diff. Now, a drive shaft carrier is molded onto the bearing with some rubber. That rubber that's holding it in right there. Geez, that's really bad. So because of that, there's no way to remove it without cutting this. And this is why we need either the grinder with the cutting wheel or the Sawzall to go ahead and cut this on two ends, so that way we can remove this entire carrier from the assembly. So before we even touch these bolts, we will get our grinder, and we're going to make two cuts on opposite sides here. So we're going to do one here, and then that'll allow us to remove this middle piece, so that way we can remove it entirely from the drive shaft. So let's get started there. Also, quick note, just advice, make sure to use eye protection when you're doing this. Okay, so we went ahead and made our first cut here. As you can see, we went all the way through the metal. That loosened up this side, so we'll go ahead and make a very similar cut on the other side of the carrier, and that'll be it for the grinder use. Okay, so it's a little smoky in here right now, only because we burned some of the rubber that was on this with the grinding wheel. Also, when you're doing this, I happen not to have any cutoff wheels at home. It'll make it so much easier if you don't have to make a cut this fat because you only have a grinding wheel. So definitely get yourself some cutoff discs. But now that the two cuts are made, as you can see, we have one on either side. We can use a small pry bar or a large screwdriver, and what you'll do is actually just pry that right off. So you can see that comes off really easily, I would hope. Alright, so that opposite side cut didn't go as well as I thought, so I needed a little bit of persuasion with a pair of pliers. But you can see now how soft the rubber in here is, so this is ridiculous and wasn't doing anything for us. And again, the metal piece is missing now, so this is maybe a little exaggerated, but that movement there is just crazy. And that's what you see up and down and back and forth because I can't put all that pressure there, but there's also a lot of movement going that way too. So now that that's gone, we'll actually go ahead and remove these two bolts. These are 13mm, and we'll pull those both out. I'm also glad we got new hardware because these were gross. Now that those two are off, you can see that the drive shaft kind of drops here for us. And what we'll do now is use that blade that we grabbed earlier, and we'll cut the rubber here. Alright, now once we've cut that rubber, we can go all the way around. So we'll actually feed our blade through and then just cut all the way through this inner edge of rubber here. So you can see it there. Make sure we get all the way through, and we can clean this up later so you don't have to be perfect now. Just make sure you get through it. Okay, so now we've cut that free after I went ahead and changed my blade out because mine was very dull. So we'll go ahead and pull this through now and get this off of the drive shaft. So that's completely removed there. And now that that's off, we can go ahead and just clean off the little bit of excess rubber we have here. We don't have to go too crazy, but just make it all level with what we left on. Okay, so now that that's fully off, you can see how clean that is now. This is a perfect time for you to inspect this bearing here. The bearing will make a little noise. It's not going to be completely quiet, but you should make sure that it spins freely and there's no resistance in there. If there is, then at this point, sadly, you would have to completely service your drive shaft or replace it. And that's what we were trying to go against right now. This is also a good time to mention to you that if we were doing an OEM replacement for this bearing, Audi calls it a non-serviceable part. Now we have some aftermarket manufacturers that do sell them, and even the OEM one you can find out there for just this bearing piece. But to do that, you would have to separate the drive shaft, remove this bolt here that's holding this U-joint in. So you'd have to modify a wrench and get that all in there. And it's very much a pain. You have to remove the drive shaft. You have to get in here. You have to modify some tools. And it's really a big pain in the butt to do it. I've done it once or twice on other drive shafts, and I never want to do it again. And I'm glad that JXB has a solution to make this a lot easier than it has been in the past. Okay, so now that this is cleaned off, we move on to the next step of the installation, which is installing our carrier. Now, when installing our carrier, we have a few things to keep in mind. First of all, we're going to look at one half of the carrier here. You'll see in the writing here in white that this says front. So upper front carrier. We got to keep this in mind when installing it. So this goes up top and this is the front side. Also, when holding on to the bushing itself, you'll see that the bushing says street front. In this case, I'm running the street bushing and this is the front of it. So this front needs to go with the front of this carrier. So these are going to go together right there. Make sure you match them up correctly there. So bushing is fitting the carrier. And just to demonstrate what we're going to do for installation, we're going to take this little recess within the carrier bushing, as you can see here, and we're going to match it up to this little extra that we had from removing the stock carrier and the carrier bushing. So this is going to match up onto this and go right over. And you'll see that that'll perfectly match up to the bearing that we have there already, and it'll hold it in place. So that is the installation for the top. Now if you let this go, it's going to spin, so it's going to be a pain. So right now we're just going to leave that on and move on to installing the bottom piece as well. So for the bottom, it's the same story. We have the writing here, and you see here it says carrier lower front, so this is the front side, the lower part. And the same thing with the bushing. We see street front. So that front part of the bushing is going to match up this front part of the carrier. And once those match up now, we could spin this around, get the carrier on there, squeeze well, make sure we match them up well. And once those are well matched up, we could go ahead and grab the hardware and start trying to feed it in. So the hardware for these were the black 6mm bolts. So we'll fit that in, make sure it threads in correctly. And once we got a couple threads there, we'll move on to threading in the other side. And what we'll do is walk it in. So we'll switch side to side so that way we even out the pressure that we're putting on both ends, and we don't install anything incorrectly. All right, so we have a few threads on either side now. So now is a good time to check, make sure we put everything in correctly. So we have front, and the bushings inside, we did front and front as well. And now what you'll want to do is make sure that the bushing isn't coming too far forwards and touching this end of the drive shaft here. So make sure that it's staying on the bearing for both front and back. So walk this forwards a little bit. It'll pretty much recess into that ridge that we had there from before. And now we'll just use our ratcheting wrench to just walk this in a little further and keep switching side to side like this. Now that this is snugged up, we can move on to installing the carrier onto the body of the car. Two things to keep in mind when we're installing this. Number one is we will need some red Loctite to install the bolts that go through the bearing into the body. So these bolts are exposed to a lot of vibration, so the red Loctite is a bit of a necessity here. The next thing to notice is that these holes here are ovaled. And the reason they're ovaled is because this carrier gives you the opportunity of sliding your drive shaft side to side here, so you can center it perfectly. That way you avoid any vibration. So just keep that in mind, that when we're installing this, we're gonna have to keep the drive shaft completely straight, and we'll check that later on. Okay, now to get the hardware in to the bushing to install it onto the body, we'll start with the main bolt. So we have two of these here. So the way it works is you grab this large washer that came with the kit, and you're gonna install it onto the bolt. Then we're gonna feed one of the bushings we're gonna be using for the sides into it, so like so. Then you will observe this recess here in the carrier, and then we have a bit of a bulge here on the bushing. So this bushing is going to get fed into that recess, and it's going to hold there. Once we have this bushing with the washer installed through, we'll move on to the top bushing. So we'll do the bulge from the top bushing facing down, so it goes into the recess as well. And that's sandwiching the carrier now in between the two bushings. On top of that last bushing, we need to put the small washer there that came with the kit, so we'll slide that on. And then to finish it all off, we'll grab some red Loctite and then just drop some onto that bolt. With this side prepped, we'll move on to prepping the other side, so we'll do the same thing. Bolt, bushing, through the recess there. Grab the other bushing, slide that in as well. And make sure we get that top washer in. Now that that's on, we'll do red Loctite on that end as well. Now that we have the hardware in place, we could start pushing the drive shaft up and start feeding the hardware into a correct spot. So we will start threading these in here. And we have that side threaded in. We'll move on to the other end. Now, before we bottom these out all the way, remember that we have this movement side to side here. So we want to make sure that our drive shaft is completely straight. So we're actually going to get right under it and just measure from each side. Make sure we have the same distance from each side of the tunnel and that everything looks straight. All right. Okay, so we've got the drive shaft in its correct orientation now, and we'll just go ahead and snug these up so it doesn't move. And now that those are snugged up, we'll grab the torque wrench and torque everything to spec. Okay, so here we'll start with the carrier to body bolts, and those go on at 14 foot-pounds. And we'll just check that again. Good. And good. And now for the bolts holding the carrier together, those get 25 foot-pounds. And with that, our installation is done. So now we can go ahead, put our shield on, if we did have that, put on the rest of our exhaust, and we're good to go. All right, so this is future me again. You saw me at the beginning of the video because I forgot to mention some stuff to you guys. First of all, this felt amazing. So complete transformation. I used to get this big clunk near the back every time I let off of the clutch and got onto the throttle, just when taking off, and not even aggressively. But that's gone. There's not really much MVH that I notice. Then again, if you have an exhaust, you really won't notice it much. The drone from the exhaust and just notes from the exhaust will probably drown out any MVH that you would hear from this. So I'm dropping stuff. But again, huge difference. It's night and day, and you could see how bad our old bearing was. I mean, this thing is super flimsy, skinny rubber, as you can see there. It's really not much to it. It's just falling apart really as I touch it. So the age of it and the fact that the design was made for comfort and not for performance just led to it disintegrating like it did here. And this is what you'll find on most cars. This is actually in good condition for some of the ones I've seen, and this is terrible. So this is a mod that everyone should just do. Whether you go with JXB, which I do recommend because I think the install is half an hour to 45 minutes. It's super simple. And it's way simpler than doing the OEM bearing replacement. Now keep in mind, this only works if your bearing is fine. Most of the bearings are fine, and the bearings have no issues. The issues come with the carrier itself going bad. So if your bearing is okay, which most of them are, this is really the way to go. It's better than the OEM replacement. It'll last you longer. It'll perform better. And there's not really any downsides. The NVH really isn't there, especially when you go with the street stuff. It's super soft, but still way more robust than this is. So that's what I believe there. I'm gonna plug in side-by-sides and just showing you what it looks like as you go and drive the car, so you could see the difference in movement going from the JXB carrier to the OEM carrier. And it's a drastic difference. It's night and day what you see and what you feel when you're driving the car. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. I'll catch you guys on the next one.